And now on BBC One, it's the finale of Wolf Hall. Sir Thomas Cromwell faces his imminent demise at the hands of the king.
Sir Thomas Cromwell, you stand accused of treason.
I'm sorry, Your Majesty. At the time of her coronation, I did not know that the Queen was unable to produce an heir for you.
Enough! I have no choice but to sentence you to execution.
No, you will not, my liege.
Yes, I will! I'm King Henry. Nothing can save you.
You won't execute me, Majesty, because I'm going to do the look.
The look?
The Mark Rylance look. The one with the sad, weary eyes and the kind face. And no one can resist the Mark Rylance look.
I am the King of England. I have faced down the Pope, the Spanish, and the French. Nothing will prevent your death on this day.
Here it comes. I'm going to smile now.
Nothing?
I'm going to crinkle up my eyes.
The little wrinkles.
Yes?
The gentle smile.
Yes.
You're just too adorable. You will not die this day, my good and loyal friend, Cromwell.
Thank you.
How do you know that you're procrastinating? For some, it's when they start watching cat videos at 9 p.m, only to realise it's 4 a.m 10 minutes later. For me, it's when my paperback copy of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall constantly plummets from the top of my bookshelf and lands in the place where my head would be if I was in bed at the time. The timing of this video is perfect, because I can talk about the Wolf Hall franchise, for lack of a better term, with the recent completion of the television series. In this video, I'm going to talk about the books and stage productions and the 2 TV series which adapted the trilogy. What is the draw of the Wolf Hall trilogy? As of this video's intended release, The Mirror and the Light ought to be premiering on PBS in the United States. The whole thing has already been broadcast in the UK, so there will be heavy spoilers ahead as I talk about the sequel series. You may want to come back to this video when it's all done if that's the case. I already did a video about The Mirror and the Light when the first episode came out, but those were my unscripted thoughts on a long-awaited follow-up to the original series. This is my coverage of the whole damn thing. The first Wolf Hall novel was a project 5 years in the making. Hilary Mantel was a well-established author at this point. Her first novel was Every Day is Mother's Day, published in 1985, which was a period piece based on her own experiences as a social worker. Hilary Mantel was, in short, quite eccentric, but who could blame her given her upbringing? Born in a Derbyshire village in 1952 and raised in a Catholic family, her mother's lover moved in with the family while her mother was still married to Hilary's father. They would later move to Cheshire without her father, and she never saw him again. Her last name was originally Thompson, but she took her stepfather's surname of Mantel after the move. She renounced Catholicism at 12 years old, following unpleasant experiences which caused her serious mental health and self-esteem issues. After university, she became a social worker and then later a sales assistant before she married Gerald McEwen in 1973. Their marriage took them to Botswana and Saudi Arabia. During these years, Hilary suffered some health complications which were eventually diagnosed as endometriosis. Initially, it was thought to be a psychiatric illness. Following treatment, she was no longer able to have children. As a result of the experience, she became a patron of the Endometriosis She Trust. Hilary came to work as a film critic for The Spectator magazine, or Splectator as I like to call it. As I said, her first novel was published in 1985, and she began publishing novels every few years. Her earlier works were based on her own life experiences. A Place of Greater Safety was her first novel that she wrote, but was unable to find a publisher until 1992. This novel was kind of similar to Wolf Hall, where it follows some controversial figures in the French Revolution, and follows their lives right up until the point when they're guillotined. Hilary Mantel planned Wolf Hall down to the very minutest of details. She would make the equivalent of revision flashcards and catalogue them, which carry the details of every character, fictional and real, so she could keep track of where they were at any point of her writing process. The title has a double meaning. On the one hand, it is named after the Seymour family's former estate in Wiltshire, named Wolfhall or Wolf Hall. It's a Middle English thing. But on the other hand, it references a Latin proverb, homo homini lupus, which means man is wolf to man. It was quoted by Plautus, Seneca the Younger, and Erasmus. Erasmus phrased it as, "Here we are warned not to trust ourselves to an unknown person, but to beware of him as of a wolf." It is in reference to the predatory nature of humans. One must treat a stranger as if they are as dangerous as a wolf, or act as a wolf to a stranger. In reference to Thomas Cromwell, the series protagonist, whose working class background makes him a figure of ridicule and scrutiny, it explains his view of the world, and why he moved to kill his enemies before they killed him. The first Wolf Hall novel was published on 30th of April 2009, consisting of 672 pages. The timeline stretches from 1500 to 1535 and ends just after the execution of Thomas More. Mantel provides a cast of characters and family trees at the beginning of the book, which is useful if you're going into this series without knowing the full history. It doesn't help that 11 characters are called Thomas. They even highlight how many Thomases there are in Part 2, Chapter 2 of the first novel. "Who's that?" Boleyn says. "In the corner there." The Cardinal waves a hand. "Just one of my legal people." "Send him out." The Cardinal sighs. "Is he taking notes of this conversation?" "Are you, Thomas?" the Cardinal calls. "If so, stop at once." Half the world is called Thomas. Afterwards, Boleyn will never be sure if it was him. Something to note for all three books is their unconventional layout. Rather than split up the story chapter by chapter, Mantel splits each novel into several parts, which have a small handful of chapters each. The Lord of the Rings novels are similar to this, where they have books within books, followed by chapters. Each part stops when there is a dramatic change and or time skip. Another element to Mantel's storytelling is she forgoes the traditional third-person past-tense narrative. While it is still told from third person, and keeps solely to the POV of Thomas Cromwell, she tells the story in the present. It's as if you're following Cromwell's train of thought as events pass by. These are events that have already happened, but they're Cromwell experiencing them in real time. Occasionally, there are flashbacks, but they often stay in the present as he knows it. The second novel, Bring Up the Bodies, is the shortest in the trilogy, and follows Cromwell from the aftermath of More's execution right up until the execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536. It was published on the 8th of May 2012, and won the Booker Prize for that year. The title was in reference to prisoners being brought up from their cells for execution, basically an early form of the phrase "dead man walking." Finally, the third novel, The Mirror and the Light, which is the longest in the trilogy at 883 pages, was published on 5th of March 2020 in the UK. Like the previous novel, it began immediately following an execution, and would end with another's. In this case, it began with Anne Boleyn's death, and ends with Cromwell's in 1540. The space between the second and third novels was huge. In the meantime, they made 2 stage productions and a TV series based on the first 2 instalments. Cromwell interacts with a variety of characters throughout all 3 novels. Most of them are actual people, but you'll see a small handful of fictional ones in there as well. It is important to note that every character is biased through Cromwell's lens. The key relationships to focus on are with Henry VIII, of course, along with his allies like Cranmer and Rafe Sadler, and his enemies, such as the Duke of Norfolk, Bishop Gardiner, and Thomas More. The book also allows Cromwell to interact with all 6 of Henry's wives, including Catherine Parr, long before she marries Henry VIII. This is during the Pilgrimage of Grace, while she is still in her second marriage, and her husband was forced to go along with the rebels. Catherine Howard, as far as I remember, is the only wife who doesn't have a conversation with Cromwell, but her introduction at court is the secondary catalyst to his downfall, the first of which being Anne of Cleves. Speaking of Catherine Howard, he also has several confrontations with Thomas Culpeper. However, it's Cromwell's relationship with Anne Boleyn and Cardinal Wolsey that really define the narrative, and the TV series makes it the primary focus, even in the sequel. Historically, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was Thomas Cromwell's master and mentor in all things politics at the Tudor court. With Cromwell having Protestant leanings, it is often shown by the likes of the Tudors and Anne of the Thousand Days that Cromwell opportunistically abandoned Wolsey when he was in freefall and took his place as Henry VIII's right-hand man. Wolf Hall counters this historical narrative and claims that Cromwell cared for Wolsey, doing everything in his power to convince Henry to restore the cardinal. However, Wolsey dies on his way to prison, and it is believed by everyone that he was betrayed by Cromwell. When Cromwell eventually hears of this, he is worried that Wolsey himself believed that he had been betrayed, and finds himself begging for Wolsey's forgiveness the most when he faces the eventuality of death. Anne, who was the key instrument in Wolsey's downfall, is stripped of many of her more likeable qualities. She is still innocent of the crimes put against her, but given that her manipulative persona poses a danger to Cromwell, his decision to frame her for adultery and treason is portrayed more as a fight for survival. Either she falls, or he will. He is just the one who acted first. However, the decision haunts him, because it's now made even more clear how easy it is to go from having the king's ear one day to being on the receiving end of an axe the next, or in Anne's case, a sword. The trilogy is hell-bent on including every single event that Cromwell may have had some involvement in, including the scandal of Margaret Douglas's secret marriage, the death of Henry Fitzroy, and the Pilgrimage of Grace. There are only a few fictional elements in there, the most prominent of which being the discovery of his bastard daughter from Antwerp, who comes to visit him. Historically, Cromwell did have a bastard daughter, but she was not from Antwerp. Given that the whole trilogy totals to nearly 2,000 pages, I can understand why this might be a bit intimidating to read. I certainly thought so, so that's why I listened to all three via audiobook. And even on 1.10 speed, it still took a very long time to finish. In 2013, a year after the second book was published, the first two novels were adapted into a stage play by the Royal Shakespeare Company. It premiered in Stratford-upon-Avon in January, before transferring to the Aldwych Theatre in London, running for 5 months. It is often referred to as Wolf Hall Parts 1 and 2, or Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. Like many plays, the majority of the cast members had multiple roles. Catherine of Aragon and Jane Boleyn were both played by Lucy Breers. Jane Seymour, Mary Tudor and Lady Worcester were played by Leah Brotherhead. Nathaniel Parker as Henry VIII, Lydia Leonard as Anne Boleyn, Alexander Cobb as Rafe Sadler, Joey Beatty as Mark Smeaton, Nicholas Bolton as Charles Brandon, Nicholas Day as Thomas Howard, Daniel Fraser as Gregory Cromwell, and last but not least, Ben Miles as Thomas Cromwell, all stuck to a single role. The play was well received and nominated for several awards, winning the Evening Standard Theatre Award for Best Director, that being Jeremy Herrin, and the Laurence Olivier Awards for Best Actor in a Supporting Role for Nathaniel Parker, and Best Costume Design. The popularity of the show on the West End meant that inevitably the show would transfer to Broadway. Most of the original cast, including Miles, Leonard and Parker, would take to the stage once again at the Winter Garden Theatre in March 2015. It ran for 15 weeks and was nominated for 8 Tonys, winning Best Costume Design in a Play. Ben Miles was Hilary Mantel's ideal candidate to play Thomas Cromwell. He would lend his voice to all 3 audiobooks of the trilogy. You may recognise him from the Hollow Crown as the Duke of Somerset, or Andor as Tay Colmer, an ally of Mon Mothma. The BBC loves a miniseries, especially one with both seasoned and upcoming actors, which gives them all kinds of critical praise. The announcement of making Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies into a TV series came in 2012, just a few months after the release of the second book. It would be directed by Peter Kaminsky, with Peter Strawn working on the screenplay. Initially, they were going to film it in Belgium, but they would ultimately go down the same route as many other Tudor dramas of the time, most of which were made by stars, and use several British castles, cathedrals and stately homes in order to capture the authenticity of the Tudor aesthetic, using 28 locations in total. I'll list them on the screen, but if you're interested, I have also done a video about the most popular places in which Tudor dramas are filmed. They were also hell-bent on using authentic lighting for scenes, so many interior nighttime scenes were filmed using candlelight and torchlight, causing a headache for cast and crew as they tried to duck fire hazards and couldn't see where they were going. Casting began in October 2013, and filming took place over May to July in 2014. The show premiered on BBC Two on the 21st of January 2015. It would show in America on the 3rd of April 2015 on PBS. The principal cast was filled with many Shakespearean actors, including Damian Lewis as Henry VIII and Bernard Hill as the Duke of Norfolk. However, this series was a real career boost for one Mark Rylance, who took on the role of Thomas Cromwell. Rylance had been in a handful of TV productions and films before now, most noticeably as Thomas Boleyn in 2008's The Other Boleyn Girl. But he was mostly a stage actor up until this point, doing a lot of Shakespearean works, despite the fact that he now has a reputation for being an anti-Stratfordian. That is, someone who doubts Shakespeare as being the actual author of his own works, based mostly on the assumption that Shakespeare wasn't posh enough to write them. Let's leave that subject. It's not something I have the time to get into, and for some reason it's very controversial. Anyway, the series was critically praised with an average of 4.4 million viewers in the UK. In terms of awards, it won Best Drama at the BAFTAs, the Golden Globes and the Peabody Awards. Mark Rylance was nominated several times for Best Actor and won at the BAFTAs, the Golden Globes and the Satellite Awards. Other awards included Best Cinematography at the British Society of Cinematographers and Best Sound for Fiction and Entertainment at the BAFTA TV Craft Awards. Other cast members, including Anton Lesser's Thomas More, Claire Foy's Anne Boleyn and Jonathan Pryce's Cardinal Wolsey, were also nominated for several awards. As I said, the series was a career boost for Mark Rylance. He would go on to star in bigger projects such as Dunkirk and the BFG. Still, he was not safe from Ben Elton. A few years after Wolf Hall broadcast, Upstart Crow, which is a sitcom about Shakespeare, premiered its third series. In episode 3, titled If You Prick Us Do We Not Bleed, Shakespeare feels motivated to write a play about a persecuted minority, and presenting one of its main characters as sympathetic. This in turn leads to the creation of The Merchant of Venice. By the way, the infamous Jew of Malta by Christopher Marlowe, which is infinitely more anti-Semitic than The Merchant of Venice, was written by Shakespeare in this context, and he had to give it to Marlowe as a favour. Nonetheless, Shakespeare needs to find the perfect actor to portray the nuances of his new sympathetic Jew character. Enter the actor Wolf Hall.
I've developed a revolutionary new style. Subtle, nuanced, emoting from within by means of long, sad-eyed stares. Here is my Thomas Wolsey. And here, by way of contrast, is my Thomas Cromwell.
Blimey, if we had him in a show, my plays would be twice as long. Richard III would be 8 or 9 hours. How good would that be?
Of course, thanks to this episode, my family and I now cannot mention Mark Rylance without doing the look. The Upstart Crow episode also calls out Mark Rylance's scepticism over Shakespeare's writings, which is spurred on by Mark Heap's Robert Greene.
Christopher Marlowe, perhaps. They say he's dead, but is he?
The actor Wolf Hall is intrigued.
He takes the bait, and thus do I prove one of the great truths of life and art, that just because an actor looks intelligent and can play intelligent doesn't mean that he is intelligent.
So, with the success of the first series and the release of the final book in 2020, immediate speculation began on if and when they could expect another Wolf Hall series, potentially bringing back the original cast. There were hopes that the series would continue as early as 2015, while The Mirror and the Light was still being written. To be honest, it was best that they waited until the book was finished. Can you imagine if they just went ahead and assumed what Hilary Mantel would have wanted and squished it all into 6 episodes? That never happens. In 2019, a second series was announced, while Mark Rylance himself confirmed that a sequel series was going ahead in 2022, after the pandemic and the publication of the third book. Kaminsky and Strawn both returned to direct and write. Damian Lewis came back to play Henry VIII, Jonathan Pryce as Cardinal Wolsey, albeit as a ghost, or a figment of Cromwell's imagination, Thomas Brodie Sangster as Rafe Sadler, and Kate Phillips as Jane Seymour. However, a significant chunk of the cast was unable to return for one reason or another. Tom Holland, for example, who played Gregory Cromwell, was bitten by a radioactive spider in the interim, and became too expensive to hire back, so he had to be replaced with Charlie Rowe. Bernard Hill was sadly unable to return as Norfolk due to illness, and he passed away while The Mirror and the Light was still filming. Timothy Spall took his place. Mark Gatiss, who played Bishop Gardiner, was preoccupied at the National Theatre, performing as Jonathan Gielgud in the play The Motive and the Cue. Gatiss voiced his regret for being unable to return. Meanwhile, Alex Jennings stepped into the role. Will Tudor was now playing Edward Seymour. Harriet Walter became Margaret Pole, which was ironic seeing as she was Margaret Beaufort in a previous drama and she spent most of her time tormenting Margaret Pole. And Lydia Leonard, who played Anne Boleyn on stage, was now Lady Rochford instead of Jessica Raine. One of the most notable recasts, I think, was Harry Melling as Thomas Wriothesley, or Wriothesley, but better known in the series as Call Me Risley. And I noticed that a lot of the second series was focused on the young men who surrounded Cromwell. These include his son Gregory, his nephew Richard, who had taken his last name and would become the great-grandfather of Oliver Cromwell, Rafe Sadler, who is presented as Cromwell's son in all but name, Richard Rich, who already stabbed Thomas More in the back, so his betrayal isn't as much of a surprise, and Call Me. To a lesser extent, Cromwell's French servant Christophe is one of these guys, and he is the only one who shows up to Cromwell's execution. Call Me is shown to be constantly wanting Cromwell's praise and favour, outwardly crushed whenever he gets passed over in a certain task by one of the others. At one point he is urged to go and console him, but Cromwell does nothing, and then look where that gets him. His betrayal is given quite a bit of focus. In the final episode, there is a montage of people reacting to Cromwell's death. Henry VIII is not happy as he stares from the window, throwing a glare at Norfolk and Gardiner, who did his bidding, but at what cost? Mary, who is just not entertained at all by the existence of Catherine Howard. Gregory is putting on a brave face, but he has isolated himself. Richard has also taken a moment to himself to shed some tears. Rafe, meanwhile, breaks down, unable to save the only father he ever knew. And Call Me, who was given Cromwell's home at Austin Friars as a reward for his betrayal, sits in his former master's seat, torn apart by guilt. Rafe and Call Me were probably the most impactful reactions. My guess is that the creators, realising how compelling an actor that Harry Melling could be, decided they wanted to use him as much as possible. It has received similar praise as its predecessor, and we are yet to know what awards it's going to be up for, but the Emmys is probably a guarantee. However, a lot of guff was kicked up given that a handful of characters are being played by BIPOC actors, including Amir El Masri as Thomas Wyatt and Maisie Richardson Sellers as Elizabeth Seymour, aka Gregory's wife, aka Jane Seymour's sister. There were also quite a few POC actors playing extras. To be honest, I understand why this was done, seeing as Bridgerton has already done it and gotten away with it, and a lot of period pieces have been made recently and still enjoyed some success. So as long as the overall project is good in terms of acting, writing and producing, I don't care who you cast as long as they're not a terrible person. I would prefer there to be a contextual reason for non-white actors being in period pieces, such as Oviedo and Lina in The Spanish Princess, or Sir Pedro in Becoming Elizabeth, either because they were a mercenary who went to serve at the English court, or they were Muslims who were escaping persecution. But putting a white actor and a black actor together and calling them siblings, it's not a deal breaker for me, because I'm looking at it through the eyes of someone who has seen a lot of theatrical productions, and they do colourblind casting all the time, even across family roles. Case in point, a while ago I saw a production of The Cherry Orchard where the daughters were black but the mother was white, and it was set in Russia. Anyway, while I enjoyed the second series, the main problem I think was it had an overuse of flashbacks and weird dream sequences, and they would play these scenes over and over and over to get its point across. In the first series it often cut back to a pageant that was held to mock Wolsey after his death, which starred the men whom Cromwell would eventually accuse with treason alongside Anne Boleyn. But in the second series, you can always expect to see a flashback to Anne's execution or zoom down the cloisters at Gloucester Cathedral towards Dorothea, Wolsey's bastard daughter, who turns to the camera like she's a jump scare in a horror movie. The beginning of the second episode, it's just a clip show of the first series, showing Wolsey's downfall. Who exactly is going into the mirror and the light, having not watched the first series? Thomas Cromwell is often portrayed as a villainous figure, while occasionally being given a few humanising characteristics. Since 1968's A Man for All Seasons, which set the trend of Cromwell's cruel opportunism, few others have given him leniency. John Colicos gave him a cold and logical demeanour, almost on par with a Vulcan, despite being more famous for playing a Klingon. Wolfe Morris played him as a charismatic politician. Donald Pleasance's Cromwell reminds me of Uriah Heep, while Danny Webb's reminds me of Grima Wormtongue. Neither other Boleyn Girl movies give Cromwell much focus, but Ron Cook worked well with what he had, and Barry Ward made Cromwell a caricature of his former self, a man who took pleasure in watching Anne suffer. James Frayn's Cromwell in The Tudors is the only one who bears any resemblance towards Mark Rylance's. But even he has his villainous moments, because the Tudors acknowledged that a lot of the people at the Tudor court could be okay, but a lot of them did terrible things. Despite the newfound popularity of this more morally grey Cromwell, the trend of villainy has still persisted. Sean Bean's Cromwell in Shardlake was, while brief, still content to show him as an antagonist, willing to threaten Shardlake with violence if he failed his task. Wolf Hall, at the very least, shows the reader/audience Cromwell's full backstory, which has gone overlooked until now. He faced a lot of grief and loss, what with the sudden passing of his wife and daughters to the sweating sickness. Mantel gives him the backstory of a runaway from an abusive father, and sets him up as a character who has always been fighting to survive. However, there is a difference between making a character who has previously been so villainised a little more redeemable, and completely whitewashing them to the point where they did no wrong, they could do no wrong. They're my baby, don't hurt my baby. Don't say that about my baby. I didn't really notice this in Wolf Hall until we came to the end of the first series, when Cromwell invites over Mark Smeaton, and that's where he traps him. Up until then, the interrogation of Mark Smeaton was a violent affair. Either by a knotted rope or via the rack, Cromwell extracted a confession from Smeaton that he and the others had slept with Anne Boleyn. But in Wolf Hall, Cromwell has Smeaton locked in a cellar, and he is driven mad from fear of torture. You don't have to leave a physical mark to torture someone, you know. And later this comes in the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was arguably Henry VIII's biggest act of genocide when he punished the Pilgrims. In the show, they completely cut out the fact that, following Henry's initial appeasement of the rebels, claiming he would hold Parliament in York and crown Jane there, it was all a ruse to buy time. All it took was a tiny uprising for Cromwell to justify sending armed men north and hanging hundreds of people. You can't ignore that Cromwell did some shitty things. You need to own it. It adds to what's coming to him in the end. In Cromwell's case, he fell victim to the very system he created and the very precedents he set. In the end, it didn't matter what he'd done, or how innocent he was. He made it possible for a great man to fall, and fall quickly. And you don't make a system like that without knowingly spilling innocent blood. Other dramas are guilty of doing this, not just Tudor period pieces. Remember how Richard III got sanitised a lot in The White Queen? And the Elizabeth movies with Cate Blanchett show her as doing no wrong. But you have to accept history wasn't so black and white. People are prone to being idolised, but these same people made some pretty big mistakes. It's hard not to put out everything I want to say here, because I want to hold something back for when I do cover Thomas Cromwell, and in particular I want to analyse the execution scenes of Cromwell, few though they may be. My opinions on certain actors' performances ought to be reserved for their own videos, should I manage to get round to them. I'm hearing enthusiasm for Charles Brandon, so I'll put him on the list. To be honest, we have faced a lot of bad Tudor dramas recently, and Wolf Hall, both the original and sequel series, managed to stand out even more, because, oh my god, they were good! I may not like the attempt to completely sanitise Cromwell's image in history, but it does at least give him the humanity he has been so sorely lacking up until this point. Consider that Cromwell was a diamond in the rough, in that he came from a working class background and worked himself up to become Henry VIII's right-hand man. That's a type of social mobility that was unheard of back in the day. Only Wolsey had managed such a feat. No wonder his enemies despised him so much. The books go into much greater detail of character arcs and events. One thing that disappointed me in The Mirror and the Light was how much gets cut out. I think it could have stood to have a couple more episodes, but I would suggest reading/watching it if you get the chance. It is much better than what we've had to sit through in recent years. I noticed that while I was editing this video, I forgot to mention all the death that has happened in regards to Wolf Hall and Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light. Most notably, the death of Hilary Mantel on the 22nd of September 2022, at the age of 70. Sadly, it meant she was not able to see her final book put out there for the world to see on the BBC. Damian Lewis's wife, Helen McCroy, who was another Shakespearean actor, she died in 2021. I remember it wasn't long after my parents and I had watched Bill, where she played Elizabeth I. And not long after The Mirror and the Light finished on the BBC, there was unfortunately the news that Claire Van Kampen, who is the wife of Mark Rylance passed away on the 18th of January 2025. And of course there was the death of Bernard Hill, which I was quite upset about. I was really hoping we'd see his final performance in Wolf Hall. It's just that I didn't know that he was recast until a few weeks before The Mirror and the Light premiered, and the day he died I was working on my James Cameron Titanic video, and I had to watch all of the BBC television Shakespeare and Lord of the Rings on top of James Cameron's Titanic, so it was quite upsetting. But that guy was a great actor. Rest in peace to all of them. So if you think I didn't go into as much detail as you wanted, when I get to certain individuals I will talk about like their book counterpart and how they are presented in the TV shows. So we're not done with Wolf Hall just yet. The next video will be the Catherine of Aragon Redux, just because it's been so highly anticipated, and I think a nice big project will be very satisfying for us all. And thank you for watching this video, and in order to keep me afloat in the interim between this video and the next video, please make sure that you subscribe, like the video, share it round, go and watch some of my other videos. Let the algorithm know that I don't want to be forgotten. Please don't let the algorithm bury me. And also, if you're a patron, you will have more immediate updates as to how things are going regarding making videos. And I must thank my patrons right now. Thank you guys so much, you're wonderful. Hopefully it won't be long until the next video. And my highest level contributors, thank you Alison Cuff, Anna from Gustine, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. Thank you all so much. And now I'm off and we are done.
Book him, Mr. Burbage. Trust me. Us brainy birds will go totally wibbly-wobbly for an actor like that. This gal's already a member of the wolf pack. Woo!